Uh, Tom, thank you again for inviting me to talk. You asked me to talk about, if I can remember correctly, the difference between life in Norway and life in the US. And so I should introduce myself to everyone who doesn't know me. My name is Richard Phillips. I'm a Foreign Service Officer who served in Norway for the last 3 years, just came back in July. I worked in the consular section, so I had a lot of interaction with regular Norwegian students primarily, and lots of regular people who live and work in Norway. Not all Norwegians, of course, but I had a lot of interaction with Norwegians. I also am learning to play bagpipe, so I was part of a bagpipe band, which you wouldn't expect in Norway. But the important part of that was, again, interacting with a lot of regular Norwegian students, professional people, retired people, all of them that played bagpipes or the drums in the bagpipe band. And then I went to the American Lutheran Church, and there I hung out with a lot of Americans, of course, but mostly Americans with either Norwegian heritage or Norwegian spouse, Norwegian partner, Norwegian connections. So those are kind of my everyday connections to Norwegians while I was in Norway. I tried not to just hang out with Americans. People do tend to group together. But I tried to spend as much time as was possible with Norwegians and even regular Norwegians. And I mentioned to Inger, one of my favorite Norwegians I hung out with was her mother-in-law down in Tonsberg. Actually, Nutteroy. She'd be very unhappy if I said she lived in Tonsberg. But she was one of the few people that I only spoke Norwegian with, mostly because Inger told me only to speak Norwegian with me, or told her only to speak Norwegian with me. So again, my name's Richard. I'm a Foreign Service Officer. I was in Norway for 3 years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between life in the US and Norway. And I will say, this is really one person's opinion of the differences, because you can only know what you know. And it always catches my attention when people would ask that question. Norwegians would say, what's the difference between the US and Norway? Or what do you like about Norway, versus the US? Or don't you think Norway is so much better? Or, don't we have great nature? And I would always think about that. And I think about just the relative size of the two countries, and the population differences of the two countries. And so I don't want to talk a ton about statistics, but, the US has 331 million people, and Norway has 5.3 million people. And the US has a very diverse population. It's got 18% Hispanics, 13% African Americans, 6% Asians. So just in those populations alone, that means there's 59 million Hispanics in the US. There's 43 million African Americans. There's 19 million Asians, so there's more of those subsets than there are in all of Norway. And then I even looked in the DC area, there's 6.3 million people in the Washington, Arlington, Alexandria area. And again, a very diverse population. African Americans, 25%, Hispanic, 16%, Asians, 10%. And Norway, not that they're not diverse, but 5.3 million, 765,000 immigrants. And out of those, a good chunk of them come from Poland and Sweden and Germany and Lithuania. And then others from Syria and Somalia and Iraq and Eritrea and the Philippines and Pakistan. So when you talk about Norway and the US, and you have to realize that you're talking about two very different places. So when we talk about my life in the US versus Norway, even then, I've been back since July, and I've spent a part of that time in South Dakota, very different than the part of the time that I spent in the Clarendon Courthouse part of Arlington, Virginia. So very, very different experiences in South Dakota versus DC, and that's just in the same country. So having said all that, and kind of hopefully setting the stage, I'll talk about some of the things that I just noticed every day, or certainly very frequently, between Norwegians and Americans, and life in Norway and life in America. And, let's start with something as simple as smiling. And I know that's kind of a stereotype of Norwegians, but boy, I just saw that difference very starkly in my neighborhood. I live right downtown, kind of a couple blocks away from the Royal Palace, beautiful part of the city. And I would go walking literally every day. I'll talk about that. But I would be out walking all the time. And one day, I specifically kind of counted the distance and the time that I was out, and I walked for hours and I walked for miles. And during that time, not one person said hello on the street. Not one person even made eye contact and smiled. Um, and and I had some friends that were visiting from Washington State, and we're out on the street, and he is a particularly friendly American. And I just was laughing because I walked past a Norwegian couple, and he was behind me, and I knew he was going to say hi. And sure enough, he said hi, and they looked at him like, they had bumped into a pole or something. Like, why are you talking to me? Whereas in South Dakota, and we do have some slides here, so we can switch to the next slide unless you want to see me all the time. In South Dakota, on these bike paths that they have, and I live in Sioux Falls, and it's a very nice place, you can't walk 5 feet without somebody saying hi, and everybody smiles at you and everybody waves. It's just a very different culture. Now, as I said, even in the US, you get that difference, because when I was in Clarendon Courthouse, you can walk down the street and it's probably somewhere in between. There are some people that are friendly and some people that pretty much ignore you. It's not New York City, big city, but it's much more crowded. And so people do kind of give you your space, and it's COVID times and people give you more of their space anyway, or more of your space anyway. But pre-COVID, boy, I sure noticed that in Norway, that people just don't talk to you. You could go to the grocery store, you could walk around the grocery store the whole time. You could stare at an aisle and be looking for something. The grocery store clerks or somebody is not going to say, can I help you find something? And if you ask, they're very friendly and they would be helpful. Well, they're not friendly, but they would be helpful. But they sure don't go out of their way to make small talk. They're polite, but not necessarily friendly. So that smiling thing, I really, really noticed that quite a bit. And that kind of carries over to conversations. With Norwegians, again, they'll be cordial, they'll be polite, but not necessarily friendly. You don't get a lot out of a Norwegian on a first date, on a first encounter, or a fifth encounter. Sometimes, it takes a while for them to open up. And for a lot of Americans, you get their life story on day one, and they ask you a million questions on day one, and they invite you over to their house right away. Like, hey, why don't you come over? We'll have dinner, and blah, blah, blah. They're just so much more open. And again, that's a very regional thing in the US as well, but it's not regional in Norway. And they are reserved from Oslo to Kirkenes. You're going to find very reserved Norwegians. So that whole conversation thing is very different. And then language. I didn't ever meet a Norwegian that didn't speak English as well as I did. I'm sure there are some, but I never met them. I met immigrants to Norway that didn't speak English as well as I do, and them I got to spend a lot more time speaking Norwegian. But with a Norwegian, because they spoke English so well, they would just default back to English immediately. Even if you tried to speak Norwegian to them, if you do your best with Norwegian, as soon as they figure out you're not a native speaker, which of course takes about 3 syllables, they default back to English. Now, again, the immigrants to Norway wouldn't do that. So you could get a lot more time to speak Norwegian with an immigrant. Some friends of mine that knew that I was trying to speak Norwegian, like Anna and a couple friends in the bagpipe band, would speak Norwegian to me. But just your average Norwegian, they would just default right back to English and make things simple for them, simple for you too, but a little bit disappointing. So the whole language thing, whereas of course, as you know, in the US, it's very uncommon for the average American, and this is not an average group here, so lots of folks in this group speak another language, but they're a vast majority of Americans, I would say that unless they're a heritage speaker of a foreign language like Spanish, or any other language, they don't study a foreign language, and they don't need to. They can travel throughout that population of 331 million people without speaking a foreign language. So, so again, when you start talking about language fluency, Norwegians speaking English and Americans speaking English, but not having any other language fluency, I think that's very different.
Richard,
yes.
could I get you to start your video so we get a chance to see you?
Oh, I don't have my video started? Oh.
No.
Okay, there. How's that?
Thanks.
Sorry about that. I thought it was started originally.
No.
Well, now that you can see me, you probably will turn the video off yourself. So, just kidding. So anyway, I was talking about the differences. So let me talk about another very stark difference that you see when you work in Norway is the difference in how Norwegians and Americans approach holidays. Norwegians have a lot of holidays. And of course, in the embassy, they're lucky they got to take American and Norwegian holidays. But even Norwegians, they have 3 weeks off in the summer. They have 2 weeks off in the winter. They have 5 weeks of vacation. They have virtually unlimited sick leave. They have childcare leave. They have, just so much leave. And they take it. Then they take it unapologetically. I would say that's the term I would really want to throw out there. They don't make any excuses for taking their leave. They say, this is my leave. I'm taking off. I know there's a lot going on in the office. I'll be back in 3 weeks, and there'll still be a lot going on in the office, and we'll go from there. If they have a baby, they're gone for their 9 months to a year, and then they come back and they go to work and they work hard, but they don't come back and say, I'm sorry I was gone. They just come back. Whereas Americans, I know, even if they take leave at all, because a lot of Americans have leave that they don't use year after year in the government service, they'll lose leave. And if they do take leave, they'll apologize, like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be in on Friday, or, I'm off next week. I'm taking the whole family to Disney World. We don't do this very often, but they always have to make an excuse if they're taking a holiday. They don't ever say, I have holiday, I'm taking it, I'll see you later. So, so that's a very different thing. And let's see, I would say, again, another big difference that I see is how they approach the use of cars. Now, again, very regional in the US, a lot of folks in the DC metro area try to stay out of their cars, but in general, across the United States, and I have lived in the United States from Washington State to Florida. Whoop, I got that light on. And, New York to Texas. So I've lived all over the US. And right now in South Dakota, every trip in the US starts with going to your garage or your driveway and getting in a car. And then where are we going? We going to the coffee shop, we going to the grocery store, we going to a park. But whatever we're doing, we're going to go get in the car and then we're going to that thing. Whereas in Norway, certainly where I lived in town, and I had a car and I could drive and I didn't have to pay the tolls and my gas was cheaper. But I started every trip with walking someplace, usually to some public transportation mode, or just walking. And that's what most Norwegians did. And in the bagpipe band, I knew Norwegians that were adults that didn't have a driver's license. I knew Norwegians that were adults that didn't own cars. I knew Norwegians that, had cars, but they were in a parking garage and they drove them when they went out of town. They didn't just get in their car for every trip that they do. And again, in the US, most of our cities are certainly designed that way. Suburbs were designed around cars. And so people get in the car and then they say, where are we going? Are we going to the coffee shop? Are we going to the grocery store? Are we going to grandma's house? But whatever we're doing, we're getting in the car first. So very different attitudes in how they approach cars. And let's see, I had a couple more things written down. I wanted to approach the difference in the seasons, because Norwegians have those dramatic seasons. And for, people who have traveled there, you've seen some of the seasons. I think it's really interesting to live there and see the transition. I'm a fan of spring and fall because I like those transitions. But, the Norwegians embrace, I think is the term. Although, again, they talk about the weather quite a bit and they complain about the weather quite a bit, even if they embrace it. But they know that winter is coming, to coin that term from Game of Thrones that everybody's aware of. But even in the middle of summer, when the weather is gorgeous, they will say, "Oh, this weather is gorgeous, but it's going to be winter soon." Like, okay, fine. But on the flip side of that, in the depths of winter, when it's dark and cold and they haven't seen the sun in a long time, they will say, "But the summer is going to be gorgeous." So they kind of embrace whatever season they're in, but look forward to the change of the season to the next one. It's just kind of always there as a subtext of what's going on with their life because the seasons are so dramatic. And again, for an American who lives in Washington State, you get a little taste of that. Certainly if you lived in Alaska, you would get a taste of that. But for the average American, seasons aren't quite as dramatic. Some people love winter, some people love summer, but you don't have those long, dark winters that just kind of hang over your shoulder in the winter and the summer as a part of your life. And, Oslo is fairly mild for that. The people who live up north deal with that a lot more, but I think the way you approach seasons is very different. And then I was told to avoid politics, but I will just hit on this part of Norwegian culture is I do think that in Norway, they just have a sense of the collective good and the collective responsibility of everybody. And that's another thing that just kind of underpins everything that they do. Not to say that they don't complain. I mean, their taxes are high and they will talk about taxes if you get them drinking enough. They'll definitely talk about taxes and salaries and money. They don't like to do that very much, but they will. But there is a sense of this is necessary so that the grocery store clerk can afford to live, so that education is a universal right, so that everyone has access to good health care. They will certainly complain about those things around the margins if you get to know them well enough and they do talk to you. But underpinning all that is this is necessary because we all benefit from the way things work in our society. And in the US, I just think there's a radical feeling of freedom and independence that Americans want to say, I have a right to do this and I have a right to do that. And it's much, much less about the collective good. Again, maybe that's a broad generalization. There's certainly plenty of folks that do the right thing in America and want to help. And I've seen that in my own state with COVID, as Sioux Falls, South Dakota tried to band together to help local businesses. And I know a lot of places have done that. But I think it's not as universal as it is in Norway. They just approach COVID as a collective dugnad. And that's the way the king of Norway approached it. And that's the way the prime minister approached it. And they said, this is something we all have to do together. And if you know the term dugnad, that's for the club or the housing development or something where they come together and they work together to clean up or to raise money or whatever it is they're going to do. And that's how they approached COVID was, this is something we have to do. We're closing bars. And the Norwegians were very upset when they closed the bars. We're not serving alcohol. We're canceling 17. Mai, the parade, the biggest day of the year, and we're canceling that. And not that there wasn't some grumbling. I'm in the bagpipe band and they canceled the parade. That was one of the first things they canceled was the St. Patrick's Day parade. People complained about that, but they complained about it with an idea that this is necessary for all of us to get through this together. we'll get back to normal. We'll have 17. Mai again. The bars will open again. We'll be able to meet together again. But right now, that's just not possible. And I think that sense of working together for the collective good is a little more universal in Norway. So those are some of the day-to-day things that I saw. And I will go back to what I started with, which is this is one person's opinion. I knew Americans that were at the embassy that did not like Norway at all and couldn't wait to leave, that were counting down until their tour was over and they could leave Norway. And of course, I knew others that were trying to find any way they could to stay in Norway, to the extent that one of my colleagues, Max, was able to get out of the Foreign Service and stay in Norway. Fortunately, his husband is a British citizen, so he had residency, but he loved Norway so much, he essentially said, why would I go anywhere else? This is as good as it's going to get. I'm staying in Norway. So these are just my opinions of some differences between my life in the US and my observations of life in Norway. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Richard, when you said there were some people who really just couldn't wait to leave, what were the things they didn't like about it?
What here? Joyce is reminding me, this particular individual I'm thinking of was single, and it's hard to break into Norwegian culture. It's hard to make Norwegian friends. Again, I knew Americans that were married to Norwegians who said, I still am not really accepted by my spouse's family as an intimate part of the family. So I think it can be very lonely for Americans that are there. Again, if you don't speak the language, it's even worse. If you don't like to do stuff outside, if you're not into nature, I should have mentioned that. If you're not into skiing in the winter and hiking in the summer, you really limit your options of what to do, because all the Norwegians go out and do that all the time. So I think it's just very lonely. I think she in particular was very lonely, and she wasn't the only one. I know other Americans who have just complained that it's hard to make Norwegian friends and it's hard to break into Norwegian society. You have to work really hard to do that.
Richard,